Go ahead.
So in 2010, I was selected to do a project in Tor Bella Monaca, and amongst a very large group of people, including Maximiliano Fuchsas and Renzo Piano and Richard Meyer and many others. The mayor had been, he had the youth in the fascist party, the MSI, Movimento Sociale Italiano, but he had kind of repented and he became he created the Center Party. He was a Minister of Agriculture in Berlusconi's party, but he had this reputation of being extreme right. And but he had repented, and he had, even after my presentation of the project. Are we working?
Yes.
After my presentation of the project to 3,000 people, the representative of the Jewish community in Rome talked, and that made clear that he is no longer extreme right and anti-Semite and so on, which was his reputation. But as I always said, I don't care what are people's convictions, as long as they do the right thing urbanistically, because that is going to survive them, or architecturally. If they do good things, if they are bad people, you shouldn't care, because buildings last longer than people. If they do bad buildings, they are good people, don't work for them. It's better to work for bad people who do good architecture, because that's going to survive them. Now, when in that, where I was selected in this congress, which was called Roma Millennium, Alemanno, the mayor, had a sociologist presenting the cost in time and money to different social classes in commuting. Now, how much time and money people spend per class per day traveling to their work. And it turned out that it's absolutely unlivable for the more impoverished classes, the lower income classes, because the rich, they don't care anyway. I mean, we are part of a privileged class, even if we don't have lots of money, but we are part of that privileged class. Whereas most people who have common work spend inordinate amount of time in terrible traveling conditions and just to go to their work. So he said the project must be to transform our metropolis, which is basically monocentric, into polycentric organization, and that's where he encountered my work, and the influences I said were important on me, like Eliel Sarin and Otto Wagner and so on. The idea that the large city must be a conglomerate of small cities which are relatively independent, so that people can work basically where they live. Now, there are lots of suburbs in and around Rome, which most people don't visit when they go to Rome. Some of them were extremely successful, built in the 1910s and 20s. And Garbatella, for instance, is an absolute marvel, which was like an English garden city, but translated into Italian, including work and really urban, and a big church and lots of schools and lots of employment. The problem started after the war with social housing, and we should in fact call social housing anti-social housing, because they are I always said, what's the point in doing social housing if you don't have social workshops, which a man who depends on, or a family who depends on social housing can have a low-cost workshop where he can establish a business. This is generally impossible. And the mayor had understood that, and he wanted to act on this, and the worst slum in Rome is called Tor Bella Monaca. It's well beyond Cinecittà, on the northeastern part, just beyond the Anulare, the peripheral road. 29,000 people live in 18 tower blocks and 60 slab buildings, most of them extremely repetitive. some up to 10 stories high. And it's infested by mafia and extremely poor environment. The buildings are so expensive to maintain that the future, the mayor can't, the town hall, they can't afford on, and the entity, I forget now the name of, who do this popular housing, they can't afford to repair them because these tower blocks, the water is leaking between the concrete panels, even on the 10th floor. And so he said, we have to, it's a very large area, several hundred hectares, and we are going to demolish systematically these settlements and replace them by new quarters, which are built with the traditional urban fabric. And the fabric I proposed was what he liked, which was to use the famous Roman palazzina, which is a small condominium, about 8 to 10 parties per staircase, forming a small palace, and therefore it's called palazzina, small palace. It's in other words an apartment block, which is basically where the Roman modern bourgeoisie has grown up and still live today. Parioli, many different quarters around Rome.
Leon, what year were the tower slabs built? How old were these buildings that you were going to replace?
In the early 80s.
Yes. Right, yeah, okay.
They are 30 years old, and really they were basically calculated to last 50 years, but we know that when something is calculated to live a short time, it's rotting well before. And these buildings were always in substandard, with the joints. Concrete, large prefabrication is okay for industrial buildings, but doesn't work at all when it's of low quality construction for residents.
Thank you.
The experience is worldwide. We also know that concrete is an extremely toxic material, using a lot of synthetic energies and synthetic materials and energies. It's just unaffordable in the long term. We actually, once we elaborated these building types, which are basically 3 stories walk-ups, so that you can walk up and with a penthouse on top, and basically using ground floor as with shops and workshops, and the top floors for residents, with 1 underground parking. And because that is what's the problem with these palazzine, which were built starting with 1930s. They replaced generally villas, which were built on a lot of certain size. So they were allowed to build out, to demolish the villa and replace the villa with a building which would just stand proud 5 meters from each edge of the lot. Yeah. Which ended up by having these small palaces 10 meters apart, both sides 5 meters of the fence, but then they always have a fence in between and ramps and dirt and garbage cans. What I did was to use these small palazzine to build a larger insula, a larger block, 5 or 6, and then having in between a purely pedestrian courtyard or a patio or something which is semi-public. Yeah. So you have, when you add these blocks of 5 or 6 small blocks, you will get an extremely rich urban pattern. Right. I know it works because we have been building them here in Krier now for 10 years, and they are fantastic. I mean, they are really something which is, which I think has enormous future in it, because you can build huge densities and still have very high urban environment with very comfortable lighting, a good scale, mix of use, and very comfortable spaces in between.
Yeah, you'd mentioned that before when you came to San Diego, and we toured that about century-old area where the trolley line was coming through. It was mostly single-family homes that were still detached, but had attached on a work building in the 50s. Yes. And so they were horizontal. They were more horizontally mixed use, and they needed to take that next step up and this Palestina device gives you vertical mixed use, and that next step up from single story, double story urbanism. It's interesting though that it's also being used in your concept behind Tor Bella to take down a vertical sprawl and take down and still have the density and the intensity to house the people.
Well, we were taking the 29,000 population to 45,000.
Yeah.
Nearly doubling the density.
Yeah.
And because there is land around Tor Bella Monaca, which is now agricultural, it's some archaeological land, we had space to build the first quarter, the first complete urban quarter, without demolishing anything. And therefore you can translate then the first number of people from the first blocks which are being demolished into buildings which are ready to receive them. And of course, because he is more of a liberal conviction for economy, this would be done by the private industry. He didn't want to do it with the big centralized housing agency, which are totally corrupt and do terrible things. And that is actually what killed the project, because he didn't find an agreement with the building mafia, and they just combated this in collusion with the Italian so-called intellectuals and socialists.
Yeah.
And they killed the project.
Yeah.
And as if anyone had to gain anything from killing such a beautiful project. We had a small development of exactly this scale and this character built in Alessandria in northern Italy, in Piedmont, together with Gabriele Tagliaventi, who you know, and which works very well, which was very successful, and people love it. It's popular. It's mixed use, and so the solution had been tested. These were not experiments. We also know that people love these palazzina. They're hugely successful. They are the most successful residential areas in Rome. But this was not permitted, because I never felt such hostility in the audience, because the whole of Rome, all the developers and the chicaria of Rome was there, and I felt that this is impossible to do. And the mayor spoke after about the polycentric city. I mean, we could have had him at CNU. He understood exactly what is needed for Rome. But that's not permitted, because as we know now, our society is not moved by rational thought and wisdom, but by a band of criminals. I mean, there's no other word.
Well, how about the urban pattern? One of the big changes is a one way in, one way out, and then you've obviously applied a hierarchy of street types.
In Rome, you wouldn't have that problem, which you have often in America, of gated communities.
Yes,
this is almost unknown. The house is a gated community.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Or the maximum, the block, as in Paris, you have the Paris villas where you have private homes within the town and you enter through one gate, because they were big villas which was then settled in the 19th century with artist studios and workshops and so on. Yeah. But in Rome is very little known. So the land is mostly public. And that is why the town hall has to do something about it, because he can't afford to maintain. There's so much public space which is run down, full of garbage, and it's unmaintainable.
Yeah.
And even when I had the first interview with Italian television, RAI, the radio television Italiano, the journalist, she was there 3 days before to talk to the different groups of thugs, not to do problems when we do the interview, because this was a very public project. I was in the papers for weeks and so on. But she had been talking to this, even paid them probably a bit to be calm. But when we started, as soon as the camera turned, the fire started of garbage taking off, cars shrieking around us. And so it's an environment which is impossible to reform. And even the mayor, who seemed to be so powerful, in the end, he lost the elections partially because of this problem. Because he was then under investigation for some mafia business, but it's a mafia who investigated him because he was not mafioso enough. I can't say that I didn't have much to do with him, but I felt that in the whole of the people I met in Rome, he seemed to be the only honest person. No one has to understand that the Italian right, they are mostly motivated, they are neo-Catholics. They are very much invested in the idea that the family must not be left to perish, because it's the most important. That's not my conviction, but I think they are right as far as family goes, that without family you can't have society. And so they are easily, deleted from any serious discussion because they are supposed to be on the right. But right is part of democracy, it's left and right and center. And that's why I think there's it's so important that we insist that we are of no party, that we are available for anyone if they let us do the right work, because architecture is something, and building and urbanism is the thing which transcends political convictions. And mixed use and mixed income is the most essential instrument to have people of different classes living in peace, doing their jobs because they need each other.
Yeah.
There was a very good example. One of the reasons to have smaller blocks rather than these enormous military operations, kilometer long, like the Corviale, is the worst slum in Rome is called Corviale. 1 kilometer long, 50 meters high, done by a famous architect. And it's the worst slum in Italy. So it's fame and prestige and good political credits don't do anything to do the right kind of architecture. But the most important thing was not to engage very large development so that each palazzina could have its own parking with its own ramp in the building, not in the space in between. And it's possible because I worked very much together with Cristiano Rosponi and Jamshid Seperi.
Yes.
Jamshid had designed in K Street, on K Street, in Washington, a building which was between party walls, but which had exactly that size. And it had enough parking with a single ramp on 2 floors under the building. So the idea is to bring back also smaller operators in the building market. Right. Not only the big banks with gigantic loans and the enormous power and criminal power behind it, but to allow a competition of a small scale to create a higher quality of development. And that is clearly not possible because the market is so monopolized that all the small developers are being excluded from integration into the system.
Yeah, especially in subsidized housing areas where, like you were saying, it's brilliant that work must be a part of your social housing. But when you subsidize the building, and then the banks, they want the commercial square, ground floor to be of the ability to have a tenant that's a national chain, and then you lose that ability to cultivate development and architecture and design of your place as a part of your economics, your local economy.
Because there were, these are not fantasies, because there were even modern experiences in Italy. I remember in a small town near Piacenza in Italy, there was a mayor who had sold lots of different sizes at very low price in the center of town for mixed use, for employment, allowing craftsmen to have a lot to build his workshop right in the center of the town. And it worked absolutely beautifully. And they are relatively small buildings which can be done by small builders, by craftsmen. And it creates this kind of economic base, which is very precious to maintain in the future, rather than being eliminated by monopoly capitalists who just sit very far away from the shop and have no clue about local markets, don't care about local markets, hate generally people who own less than them, and those who earn more they are jealous of, and they are crazy people, power mad and crazy. And it's the small crowds which in all societies in the last 1,000 years were actually the class which created civilization, I think. Obviously in collusion with the power holders of the church and the aristocracy, but there was at least between church, aristocracy, churches of different kinds, don't care about religion, religious convictions, and people, traditionally there was an agreement that buildings must be beautiful, and the rich aristocrats can appreciate a poor man's stable, and the poor peasant loves the palaces of the rich because they are beautiful. Because its beauty is something which transcends the differences and unifies mankind.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the Tor Bella project, the project for me is it's one of the first times I've seen you use 3D modeling to express your drawings. What did that mean to you?
Well, it was fundamental because Yamshid Seperi, my partner, he was then living in China. I was traveling in South America, and we were corresponding. I sent him my sketches in the evening, and in the morning I would wake up and I see these fantastic renderings, because he has an incredible eye and talent, and to three-dimensionally express a sketch is just fantastic. I mean, for me, I mean, if I get a project like you see behind, I don't need to see it built because I know this is the right thing. The torture you have as an architect to go through to build something of that quality is almost impossible. Because the more you try to get quality, the less you will get. You go crazy.
Yeah.
And my friend, I may have mentioned this, Abdelwahed Al-Wakil, he said, if you get 60%, that's about all you can get. If you want any more, you go crazy.
Yeah.
And that's why,
Sorry.
no, because the building industry involves so many people on the permitting and the execution and the technicalities and the bureaucracy and the lawyers and so on, that if these difficulties you don't have in doing three-dimensional renderings, and the art which exists now, the incredible experts who exist now to do these renderings, and also people like Yamshid and I saw the other day the Medicis on the Netflix. Have you seen the Medicis, the series?
No.
It's, I mean, the people is beautifully done because it plays in basically in Rome and Florence, because of the Pope and the Medicis in Florence, and some in Milan. But the digital artists, they have used cities like Pienza and Florence and Viterbo, a bit of Rome, and made it into completely new geography, which is fantastically attractive, unbelievably attractive. I mean, so good, no mistakes. Sometimes there's a major mistake is that Florence ends up on a hill in Pienza with a dome sitting, and the Arno flows on the hill, which is has not been seen yet in reality.
Well, isn't that what Leonardo was trying to do? Anyway.
Yes. He's also involved in this spiel.
We'll have to look for that.
But this kind of, or what you had in Game of Thrones, the capacity of design, you don't find it in building architecture nowadays. You find it in these films where you have enormous talent being absorbed and properly paid to do this kind of work. And this film, which was based on on Yamshid, lived then in Shanghai, and he worked with a very expert company that they did a beautiful film, which was then shown to these 3,000 people in Rome with music by Ottorino Respighi, The Pines of Rome. I mean, it's music to cry, so beautiful. Huh? And it's very seductive. And everyone sees this is what we want, but they must not have it, because it would prove that they were wrong for 60 years to build the garbage they have loaded down upon society. Isn't it? And therefore, once you have committed crime, you have to go to the bitter end, because you cannot just say, okay, I repent. Because your past haunts you, and that is why I never wanted to be involved in this kind of industry, because you get you cannot not be corrupted. We now have even in Kerala, now we have in our new development, we have two very tall skyscrapers, but which I couldn't sleep for it. But the only way to maintain this kind of low fabric of 4 to 5 floors, 3 ideally, but with some penthouses and recessed, but to maintain that quality of walkable fabric, you had to have some access to take the load of surplus of what I think is criminal density. But that excess density should not ruin the fabric. So at least by having 1 or 2 of those, you can then fulfill the numbers which now the the tabulators and the legislators, it's all about numbers. They didn't care about cities. If the numbers are right, they're happy and they get their money. So we keep them, we concentrate them in some major deadly sins. And I always say to them, I can't do this because I'm no longer a Catholic. I can't go to confession, but you are Catholic, so you can confess and be forgiven your sins. But it's something, which needs to become part of the general discourse, that authorities should know what they are doing. They should not allow densities which condemn building fabric just to become fabric of livable by the rich, where the others are enslaved just to come in, spending hours to get there and to leave. The mega dense city, the excessively dense city, is also creates social outcasts and a class of usurpers.
Well, isn't that what this project is an attempt to fix? That social outcast buildings that were built in that repetitive, anti-social form, you're bringing that fabric back. Isn't that the lesson? One of the lessons of this? What are some lessons?
I think that is the major lesson, and also that the mayor Alemano was talking a lot about the fact that a large city like Rome cannot have a single center because it's congested beyond what is bearable. And the problems of garbage and administration and of numbers is just overwhelmingly complex to resolve. Whereas if you have many cities outside which have their own town hall, solve their own garbage problems and have their own production and administration, and the problems are much smaller. Now, an important part of the project was not just to look at reforming Tor Bella Monaca, but the whole peripheral zone. So I studied an area of several square kilometers which are built up now by very poor fabric of buildings, which are generally 2 or 3 story high buildings, which are called abusivo, because they were built often overnight in the 50s and 60s by people, because once you have a fabric in the morning which was not there in the evening, it cannot be taken down. So they built very quickly overnight 2 or 3 story high buildings cast in concrete, and then they were there, and they are called abusivo, and that's where the poor people live generally. They are often built on a rather poorly grid, very poorly serviced, with often streets not paved. But structurally, they are still beginnings of a town. So I did a project how these rather poor buildings could be, what is missing there is generally the mix of fabric, the work, or what makes the real town. But how this could be mixed, because often they're empty lots, the edge is ill-defined. To extend them slightly, reform them into real urban quarters, what you in America called, what Andres and Galina Tachera, what they call a sprawl repair. We applied that to Rome, to the Rome periphery, and I think it could work. It's excessively complex to transform existing buildings. Therefore, we went for the total demolition of Tor Bella Monaca, because it cannot be reformed. I did in the 60s when I started, in the 70s when I started teaching in London. We did projects with my students, including Zaha Hadid, people like that, who was my student, how to reform social housing areas in London. And my take was always, we keep anything above 2 stories and integrate it with a new urban fabric which surrounds it so that the voids become real streets and squares and are filled with workshops and with stuff which is attractive rather than disgusting as they are now. And, but that was rather conservative. Now it turns out that it's much cheaper and it's much more worthwhile and ecological to destroy these poorly built buildings, which cannot be properly maintained, and start afresh. When we had a detailed design of several of these palazzini, we calculated them with engineers to build in Roman brick. And it's quite affordable. The bricks are not, have not been forbidden yet, and they can be handled by one hand. I mean, they are the best building material which has been around in Rome for 2 millennia. It's an enormous, and people love brick buildings, and a mixture of brick and render is, if you can afford it within social housing standards, you can certainly afford it for private development. But because we would build an alternative to the dominant horror which are now exercised in and around Rome, that was not permitted. I think it can no longer, this alternative can no longer be hidden because there are now so many new urban projects also in the United States. There are many rebuilding projects in Germany, of rebuilding the center, traditional house in the center of Frankfurt and Dresden and Potsdam and Berlin, that the elite can no longer, the elite, I always say like this, because there are no elite. An elite has also to be morally responsible, not just fill their pockets. That the society, civil society sees that they have been lied to for 60 years, that modernism was something which could be, which is very interesting when it goes to car design or aeroplane design, but modernism has brought nothing to the common building of cities, houses, and all the so-called innovations which are so highly applauded in modernism can be achieved by traditional architecture. Can have large windows. 19th century railway stations, they were all done in glass and steel, but doesn't need to be ugly. So there is an alternative which is ready to build, has been exercised, but still the next step is to be for big politics to embrace this. The European Union, Prince of Wales is unique, and then some small developers or medium-sized developers in Europe have done this. Some private people like private developers like François Speury with Paul Grimaud. All this had been exercised for everyone to see that it works, and yet the big political regimes of left and right and center, they still haven't seen this. There are now some mayors who, like in France, Pemzec, who I recently mentioned, 75% in the first round in municipal election. He won because of his work over 20 years with the Brightmans and Speury. So there's something happening, but it's very late to reverse the machine because it's going to such a self-destructive process that it's difficult to reform. I can't hear you.
What's the status of the project area today?
When this was presented, a storm broke loose. Not one of the images I show, of which there were 5,000 images produced to do the film. It's the first time I did a campaign to publish. Italy was my world where I published virtually every 2 weeks. I had an article somewhere, invited, not that Now I made an effort to send material. Nothing was ever published. Only the ugly skyscrapers. And that what I was doing was going to destroy social experiment, a valuable social experiment. It was published in in many places, but not in Italy. Because in Italy, the left and the right, they have a kind of modernist left and right. They are a real collusion. That modernism transcends these political differences. And you wonder why, because they have nothing to show which you could tell people, you know, this is what we do, what the future will look like. Do you like it? They never ask whether people like it. Because if they don't like it, they are told you are idiots. You don't understand the importance of these projects. Because it's done by famous architects. But what do they have to show other than fame? So I think it's very important that there is again a choice offered in architecture and that people are listened to. And that's where the Prince Charles, who had visited himself all these horrendous housing estates in England, and he knew how people hated it. That's why he wanted to change, and he was right. But he was not followed by other leaders.
How has that Roman Palatina been adapted to your Cayala, Guatemala project? What adaptations had to happen? What were some differences?
No, the thing was that we started Cayala before the Roman project, but with a much lower fabric. We had basically like a typical neo-urbanist block with 3-story urban houses, mixed use, and then with alley parking, and with an apartment above the garage.
Yeah,
that's the way it worked. But then we lost somewhat control, and densities were increased, and then we were brought back, and we inherited much higher density. And the first buildings which were done so dense just didn't work. So I brought in the Palatina, which we call here Palacito, which sounds better in Spanish, and adapted them. They were a bit, the lots we could do were smaller than the Roman ones. They were about 20 to about even sometimes under 20 meters. We built the first 12 of them, which is called Distrito Moda, which is a sort of fashion district with a hotel and a mix of offices and shops. But there you see there's very little residence. There's residence around, but not in the middle. That was a little small, but urbanistically they work very well. So then when we do new areas which are now built called Lirios, we had then and there Pedro Godoy and Maria Sanchez, they insisted that we had, because I insisted before that each Palatina should have its own plot, its own size, its own character. So it could not just be mass product. I mean, that's the idea, different architects and so on. But we were one group of architects, and we controlled the whole site. Therefore, it's absolutely essential to have real rational parking, underground parking. And with the densities which we are required to do, which is always up to between 5 and 6 floors, fabric is to have a construction module. And the construction module is about nearly 9-meter module because they're very strict earthquake standards here required. So it's a concrete module of 8.8 meters, which is about 27 feet, you know. And generally, and then we reduce the number of types. You know, there were either 9 squares or 12 squares, 15 squares. The biggest are 15 of these squares. And some smaller. And with that, we have a remarkable system of real rational parking, while when you walk through the streets, you can't imagine that under such a picturesque townscape you can have rational parking. And this is a trick which works, which Pedro developed, or we developed together, which I published in the article I sent you, how it works. So that it's really a system which is rational from parking point of view, and also allows very, very interesting house types with the central core of lift and staircase. And then most apartments have a corner room, which is very precious in a very dense urban fabric. and they are exposed always to two sides, rather than front and back. But now we have really developed that Tor Bella Monaca block, which corresponds basically to the typical Roman palazzina, to a very rational, a real rational scheme, which can then be multiplied even by industry.
What publication of yours has the most amount of your Tor Bella Monaca imagery that we can share?
It's I send you an article from the DPA, the Italian
Okay, I
Corporation.
have that. We'll link it to that article is what we'll do, because that does have the most amount of imagery and explanations of each.
There's a special article only about the palazzina,
Yeah.
which explains how the rationality of the building grid, and which is reproducible. We use it even now in Poundbury, and you know, it's a system which is really ready to mass.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it works in all climates. It works in Yemen or in Iran or in Russia.
Right, and it looks like you could have an expand or contract the court depending on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or you can have also up to 10 blocks, 10 of this palazzine with a larger garden in between. You can even have some of those blocks gated in countries where that's like in Colombia, where you know they socially segregated.
Security is in it, yeah.
But
yeah.
But you have still the open grid. That is, once the security is mastered, the politics are less dangerous. You can then open the gate. No, whereas now suburbs, you open the gate and you still have a gated community.
Right. Yeah, and you don't have as much shared space.
No. Yeah.
That is something you've studied before, where you were looking at the good proportion of public and private space, and that the modern, tower in a park had too much space, whereas there was also too tight a space, and you figured that I think it was 25 to 30% of public to private space was the good proportion.
Well,
is that something applied here?
Completely. It's different here because we own the whole land, and the whole town is like one building. But it's still true that the proportion between public and semi-public space, public space, you shouldn't have much more than 30% if you take the quarter itself. If you include parks and sports areas, it's another matter. But generally, to have a good urban fabric with streets and squares of the right dimension, you need a minimum of 25 to 30%. Then, if you have the semi-public spaces which are between the palazzine, which are also publicly accessible, or like in the new urbanist block, the alleyways which are publicly accessible, that adds up virtually to another 20%. But those spaces are open for children to play, for cars to circulate in shared space, which is always where people drive very prudently. And those spaces are then managed by the management company or by the collectivity who manages this, let's say, the larger condominium. There are many ways to manage this, but I think without this amount of space, because if you have for instance, in the residential fabric and you don't have alleyways, a lot of the front is taken up by garage doors, unless you have underground parking. And then you can't have really mixed use because you have so many garage doors that...
Yeah, and how do you service your mixed use, and how do you access with the variety without...
Yes, if you have... When you have the alleyway or the English Mews system, you can have shops in front, and sometimes on the corner you may have a garage, but which can be used even as a workshop. Because garages are interesting things. As car ownership changes and will change again in the future, those garages can become fantastic spaces for having small businesses and workshops, which they are often... You wonder where all those garages which are supposed to be in Silicon Valley where they were in horrible suburbs. You know, whereas garage in a real urban fabric is much more.
And that gets back to your comment about Rome having many cities within the city. The reason why San Francisco is under such economic housing crisis is because all of the suburbia going on in the Silicon Valley and around it, forcing the people to want to live in the very few good places, and it creates a crisis. And then therefore the towers become something that everybody wants, and you've destroyed the fabric of the good city that you want to replicate in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, once you have the skyscrapers in, that is the risk. Once you have those fellows, it brings in a totally different economy, and then honest people don't figure in that agenda anymore.
Yeah,
it's a killer. The skyscrapers are social killers. I always call them network parasites or network congestors.
yeah, right.
They really make them bad because they are bad building types.
And what we're finding in San Diego, and I think we're going to find more and more, because they're only about a century old, and we have buildings like your buildings in Tor Bella Monaca, that are asbestos, they're structurally not up to code, and they're empty, and they can't. And the reconfiguration of those buildings to make them habitable at these very low intensities doesn't make financial sense. And it's going to be more and more of these as they come online 100 years to 150 years.
Yes, yes. Because that is when you have excessive fabric, architecture doesn't play any role. It's just surface treatment. They're generally poorly built, and in 20 years you take all the garbage, the walls, and all the drive, it goes out of the window on a big heap, and it's being remantled and re-engineered. And in order to pay for this repair, you have to add more floors. And that's unavoidable. So once you let those guys into an urban fabric, they're going to kill it over the next 30 or 50 years. Anyway, they're going to kill the damn place. And then imagine when every single lot has its own skyscraper. The lower 40 floors will be unlivable. Will all be like Hong Kong, which is blissfully a unique case in the world. But will be the future of all major business districts. It's unbreathable and it's unlivable.
Any last thoughts on your Tor Bella Monaca project?
Well, I think that Italy is in a bad way. I was put on, because the university, La Sapienza, they made a special day organized with intellectuals, writers, architects, artists to stop this project. I was, of course, not invited. The mayor had the conference in Richard Meyer's building, next to the Tiber. And there they had, of course, because our people, they always think they have to invite the other side. We don't get invited by them. So there was Franco Purini, who has done a horrible, he used to work with Grigotti doing kilometer-long buildings. And he's kind of a crazy person. But he's professor at La Sapienza. And he presented a building which cut right across Rome for several hundred meters and was over 100 meters high, a slab. So he says, l'architettura deve far male. Architecture has to cause pain. And I got up and I said, cause pain to whom? Now, why do you want to put half of Rome in the shade of your building when the sun is over the peak? And they have no answer to that. They are really criminal mentalities. And they have done enough of these experiments. But the point was that after this project, I was that in Italy. I used to publish there. I used to sell furniture. I had a lot of clients in Italy, in all parts of Italy, south and north, that designed furniture for companies and for industrial companies. And all that is dead since then, because once the ban is established by the mafia, nothing can survive. They really, the next thing is they haven't killed me, but That's what they do when you insist too much, you know.
Yeah, well, thank God. All right. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and